one. Back at Darien, back at the terrible experience that we understand with Darien. And it's starting to unfold very, very slowly. So at this point, with Darien in the After Break Part 2, we can get a feeling that the project did not go the way it should go. So what I would like to start off next with is by describing the research associated with New Edinburgh. Now, what we need is a nice little bit of a plan up here. So sort of going back to the early 1700s, New Caledonia, Darien, the Caledonian, New Caledonian settlement. And let's get my annotation bar in there as well. And annotate, bingo. Right, so we're looking at New Edinburgh down here. We're looking at the fort. We're looking at the place that they would have to go on a regular basis to actually collect barrels of fresh water. Now, one of the questions is as follows. Let's see what Mark says. One of the archaeological puzzles was where all the colonists were to be settled. Much of the early correspondence was sent from New Edinburgh. So it's obvious there was a settlement at New Edinburgh. It's got to be obvious, isn't it? Which is shown on the manuscript map in front of us. On the east side of the bay, where 6 schematic buildings are located to the south of an area of morass. So I think what this is describing is, in fact, that's the morass, and it's showing 5, I think this means 5 building plots. This area on the ground comprises a narrow strip of land around 30 meters with a steep cliff behind. So is that appropriate? The area widens where a seasonal stream flows down from the hills, and at this location is the small temporary Cunna village of Sucunya. Now, this actually shows it all better on a non-contemporary map. So I think what I would like to do is, going off Piche, is to actually get that map in here. I'm scrolling through my images a minute. Just bear with me a second. Okay. Actually, that's a little bit more clearer than the other one. Okay, that's good. So there's where we're talking about that village, Sucunya. And it said, and I think this is looking at the village itself of Sucunya is said to have had 20 huts in 1979, but fewer than 5 in 2006. I think this was what we're talking about, the contemporary change within the landscape. The archaeological survey, back to the archaeology, examined the settlement of New Edinburgh. And the Sucunya village is obviously a native village. So we're looking now at New Edinburgh. Now, the archaeologists believed at New Edinburgh in 1979, where they were test pitting, that they would obviously find lots of material, lots of the waste material, broken pots, and so on and so on. But strangely enough, where New Edinburgh is marked on the map, even though they've got post holes and things like that there, they don't have any of the bits of broken pottery. They don't have the bits of broken glass. They don't have the bits of broken clay pipe. And that tells us quite clearly that there may have been structures being constructed at New Edinburgh, maybe 100 or so structures, but none of them were occupied, probably due to the fact that the water was seasonal. And by the time the buildings were ready to be lived in, the water had dried up. The site of New Edinburgh may have been chosen initially because of the small seasonal stream that flows through the village. And obviously, but at that time, suddenly, the stream and the whole landscape dried up and the landscape became unhealthy. What do we mean by that? Well, in the north, there's this what's described as a morass, which you can clearly see there, and there is the fort. And this morass may have been a swampy area, so a mangrove swamp. And this being a mangrove swamp, you can imagine that as the streams start to dry up, and it's a bit of a surface moisture, you're going to get all those sandflies and all those mosquitoes buzzing around. It would make the new Edinburgh settlement very inappropriate. And this is what William Patterson eventually said about New Edinburgh. He said, this is William Patterson, banker, "Neither fit to be fortified, nor planted, nor indeed for men to lie upon. We were upon clearing and making huts upon this improper place near 2 months, in which time experience, the schoolmaster of fools, convinced our masters that the place now called Fort St. Andrew was more proper for us." And there was a point that Henry made earlier on. And what was that point? Who are those schoolmasters of fools, Henry?
Well, obviously the leaders. Patterson himself would not actually having gone there to actually survey the site.
And also, what was it you were saying earlier on about American research papers saying about
the settlement management potentially could have been rotated between each individual group once a month, so there was no consistent management of the site, and it allowed for people to settle potential scores with other groups as they took over the authority and control of the settlement.
So in other words, an absolutely disastrous way of managing things.
Yeah.
So it would be basically like, right, what we're going to do, somebody's going to do a different lecture every week from a completely different perspective. And that sounds like an absolute disaster. The next bit that we're going to actually look at now is, looking at what we've already done, it seems that the huts from the archaeology and from what we can understand in the written evidence were even though they were built there, they were never occupied, and even as early as late January, people had just transferred to Fort St. Andrew in an area as a fort, a defensive fort alongside the sea, half a meter above sea level. They did not know at that time that things would get really bad, so you've got to accommodate in that spit 1,200 people. At this point, probably about 200 people had already died. This bit of evidence is interesting from an archaeological point of view. Fort St. Andrew, while the effort to clear and plan the new settlement in New Edinburgh was largely wasted, it seems that the creation of Fort St. George became a major preoccupation of the colonists. It's said that defending this small peninsula was now key to the whole expedition, was key to the whole project. Defending this peninsula, this is where we've gone now. This is where they're all going to live. All this grey shaded in area is where they're all now going to go. They put so much effort into digging this ditch and to building this embankment to defend themselves. As a place to settle, the site of Fort George seemed little better than New Edinburgh. The base rock was fossil coral, which when exposed was very irregular and difficult to cross. About 1/3 of the total area of the 25 hectares had this exposed coral, and about 2/3 were sandy soils. So when you think about it, it's going to be a very difficult place to occupy all year round. The land surface was flat and low-lying, little more than half a meter above sea level, while there were significant areas of swamp inside the fort which acted as breeding grounds for the insects. To the west was a mangrove swamp, the morass. So there you go. That's actually to the east, with a mangrove swamp. And then what you've got then is the site had no water supply of its own. The well itself was rainwater.
Right.
The archaeological evidence suggests that considerable effort was expended in creating the huts for the colonists. These were of earth-fast post-hole construction, driven into the very weak conditions underneath. And that would then go below sea level, which would add to rapid rot into the foundations of these buildings. Square rectangular buildings evidence the archaeologists have excavated of post holes. Various artifacts spewn across the site. The only stone-based building is what we've already intimated. So we'll go back to that image. Let's sort of go back to that one again. And I'll just show you this other little bit of a structure is. Down near the powder store is this circular structure that they found, which is there. That is the communal oven. The only stone-built structure of the whole site is a communal oven. Now, being that I've excavated lots of sites, you know, a communal oven would be the last thing we excavate because we're excavating walls and stuff. This communal oven being nearly 4 meters across. So this is the only stone bit of evidence that the settlers ever built. So with granite blocks, internal rammed floor of coral. On the west side, as a small steep, possibly step, I should say, possibly indicating the entrance of a stokehole where that lady is actually sitting. The superstructure did not survive, although the scatter of bricks in the vicinity strongly suggests that it had a brick dome. Now, this is an interesting piece of evidence. When they found these bricks, it told us one of three things. Did they eventually go to the Spanish site north of here, known as Akla, and bring some of their bricks back? Telling us that they then knew about the Spanish site of Akla that had been abandoned 40 years earlier, meaning that they could have actually settled there instead. Or they brought bricks with them, which would have been a sensible thing to do. Or they made bricks on the site. Whatever they did, they were running out of time. Part of the reason behind the move of the colonists from New Edinburgh into the safety of Fort Andrew was that they were aware that sooner or later, those damnable Spanish would actually get to the site and besiege them. I want to show you a few other images before we, they're showing you the Spanish camp up there, so you can see that on the cursor. So if we go through these images again, that there is apparently, this is in the Glasgow Museum. This is Edinburgh Museum, in the National Museum of Scotland. This chest itself was meant to be the chest of Drummond or Patterson to actually store the gold if they ever found any. Obviously, no gold would have ever ended up in this chest. And there is the archaeologist, Professor Horton. You may recognize him from Time Team, and he used to be a professor at Bristol University. He was also the advisor for the television series Bone Kickers, and another series was made. The evidence behind the series Bone Kickers that came out in 2008. And he's now the new professor at the Royal Agricultural Institute University, heading the new archaeological department. That's why I'm in touch with him. And again, a little bit of a document, one of the lists. You can see at the top there, the good town of Edinburgh donated £3,000 to the cause. So if you think about it, that's sort of their excess income. So again, that puts it into millions of pounds. And look at that there. Merchant from Dundee, £100. When you think about that, that could have been half his life savings. And you're thinking that's in the tens of thousands of pounds in today's money. Another sort of image as well. Those are those types of shacks that they would have been building in New Edinburgh, not fit for purpose. And you can imagine a good old storm, those huts are going to be over. This is what they think that those are the types of things that they're building. So if we go back to where we are now, so they were expecting an engagement with the Spanish. And so you can imagine a few points that I haven't mentioned. You're talking about men and their families, wives and children, are here. And you're thinking, why did they take their families? It's absolute madness. The threat of being attacked by the Spanish, the archaeology tells us that they put all their efforts into building these defenses, and putting all their efforts into building these defenses would be a distraction. They're unable to farm the land, even if they had seeds to plant. It's that obsession with defending themselves which is going to lead to their demise. The hatchets, the wheelbarrows, the pickaxes, the shovels, forehammers, any instrument required was sent into digging these trenches. Apparently, this is another thing as well, is apparently if a man was sick and unable to work, he was denied his food for that day. It's one description is of digging that trench, taking them away from planting and farming the land that they could be so profitable with. One description was that our bodies pinned away and grew so macerated with such allowances and hard work that we were like so many skeletons. Looking at the surviving remains of the ramparts and canal, from the description, the scale of the labor involved can clearly be understood as being vast. So what we're saying, the archaeology is actually saying that these descriptions of the men being forced to build these defenses and being told that if you don't build these defenses, you know, we're going to lose this settlement. We're all going to die. Well, they're all going to die anyway. And every single day as they're digging, they think that there's going to be a supply vessel coming in. But there's a problem, folks. The William made a proclamation, and we'll do this briefly. Not a single barrel of water is to be given to the Scots at this colony. No support is to be given to the Scots. You know, you are not to buy anything from the Scots. You are not to offer them any refuge, either their children, men or women. You are to help them in no way. And this is coming from the King of Scotland as well. He's the King of England. This is where all that animosity comes in. All he's thinking about is his English subjects. He's not thinking about his Scottish subjects. And you can start seeing through the ages why the Scots have been so resentful of the English when their own king does this to the Scots. You know, he's the King of Scotland. Is quite terrible. Trying to put that into words, trying to articulate the monstrous way these Scots are being treated. When they actually fled in June in the year 1699 to go to Port Royal, the English commander at Port Royal said, "We're not helping you. You're Scottish. Go away." So lots more people died on board the vessels that left the colony before the second expedition gets there, and they got to New York. And no assistance was to be given them at all. This was a proclamation. And also, when the and this is how dastardly this got. When the Scots basically asked for help from other nations in Europe, the other nations in Europe were threatened by the English crown, stroke Scottish crown. If you help the colonists at Darien, we might declare war on you. So in other words, if they're asking any German sort of German kingdoms, the German kingdoms are being threatened by war if they assist the Scots. You know, all those terrible things are being said and done. And they couldn't ask the Spanish either because, you know, they're directly at war with the Spanish. No, you know, no supplies were coming in. And when the supply vessels did arrive in August, there was nobody here. They left 6 men rotting within this settlement, unable to move. And the Spanish got here. They set light to the settlement. They went off. The supply vessels turned up. There was nobody there. And then the other expedition turned up in late November the 30th in 1699. And what happened is that Drummond, who was one of the commander of the group at that stage, because Patterson stayed in New York, Drummond went back to the settlement to help this next wave. It's all over the place. You know, it's a disaster. So life in and one of the things from the archaeological excavation as well, which we're being told, is that when they're actually when they're digging these defences, it looks like the defences get poorer in quality the further down the months the building of the defences goes. So in other words, they're getting weaker and weaker, no food or less food. Things are really, really bad. The colonists seem to have been largely preoccupied, and they're not trading with anybody. Things are not going their way. And think about this, people. You started off with up to 1,400 individuals. At this stage, 4 or 5 months into the project, they're having 10 deaths a day. 10 deaths a day. And we know that when the Spanish arrived there in June 1699, they see the site empty. They find 100 huts. They find 400 graves in neat rows outside the fort. And the Spanish, and just think about this, right? The Spanish burned down all the buildings. So all the work of the first wave of colonists was for nothing. So you can imagine that this is horrendous. It's also being described by the Spanish in June 1699 of Juan Delgado. Delgado describes that as they're going amongst the buildings, they find large quantities of clay pipes. Thanks for showing that earlier on, Jessica. Brandy bottles, unopened, glass beads by the bucket load. The clay pipes in particular could be identified as coming from an Edinburgh pipe maker, a certain Paul Colquhoun. And in the archaeology, folks, whilst they're excavating there in 1979 and 2004, they find a large scatter of these pipes near the bread oven. And it's described that they had barrels of clay pipes, and they were just found as the barrel rotted, the clay pipes just jumped out and went all over the place. So, the point is with this is that it got to the point that the settlers just disappeared. There was no attempt made by the settlers to actually open the bottles of brandy. So with all this, they could have planted crops if they managed to get hold of any seeds. There's evidence that they hunted turtles, because we've got turtle bones in amongst the strata across the site. But we do know from lots of descriptions that the food on board the vessels after a year was rotten and could not be used. And the point, and the thing is, we mentioned at the start of this, the excavations suggest some of the material belongings of the colonists. And some of them were very unsuitable, weren't they, Henry?
Well, yes. I mean, basically, on the itinerary of equipment, you had, for instance, 4,000 wigs.
And what are you going to do with those wigs?
Yeah, exactly.
And obviously, we don't find the evidence of the wigs, but we know that there was one report that a whole hold of one of the ships was full of these wigs, and you're thinking, no wonder it failed. We do find evidence of Scottish pottery, German pottery and French pottery and Staffordshire pottery as excavated. And we also know that the fort was abandoned by April in the year 1700 by the Spanish, because what they have found is evidence of Spanish olive jars and various other Spanish pottery on the site after April in the year 1700. Because what basically happened is the Spanish were ill with malaria, besieging the fort, and the Scots were dying of malaria and typhus and all these things. And it got to the point in March 1700 that the Spanish said, look, if you surrender, you can go on your boats and leave. If you don't surrender, we're going to massacre all of you, men, women, and children. We're going to kill every single one of you. Nobody's going to be left alive. They had a bit of a negotiation, and eventually the Scots decided to leave. Other personal objects that they found at the site, you know, numerous dress buckles, even a portable bronze sundial, which would have been quite valuable. So that's sort of the archaeology. That takes us to the end of the colony after less than 2 years. And, you know, I've already mentioned before that, in 1699 in June, whoever was left just jumped on board the vessels. And there was a description in New York that after they had been rejected from Jamaica, they were given, you know, they were given no food, they were given no fresh water in Jamaica. It's said that after they had reached New York, the men looked rather like skeletons than men. And only one of the original vessels, the Caledonian, ever arrived back in Scotland. The much hoped for relief had left Scotland in May 1699, a few weeks after the first optimistic letters. When these other vessels reached the settlement in the August of 1699, there was nobody there, so they waited in the harbour. So the other group of people, this is the other story now, the final bit of the evidence. The archaeology of the second expedition. The second and larger relief expedition was not warned that it had been a disaster. 4 ships sailed, 1,300 colonists and 100 women. They set off from the Clyde on the 18th of August, 1699. They got there a bit quicker than the first expedition. They arrived by the 30th of November. They weren't warned. And this is what they found. These are descriptions from a minister of Francis Borland when they saw the settlement. The archaeology bears this out as well. Nothing but the vast howling wilderness, the colony deserted and gone, their huts all burnt, their fort most part ruined, the ground which they had cleared adjoining to the fort all overgrown with weeds. And we looked for peace, but no good came, and for a time of health and comfort beheld trouble. Another description from another minister. 4 ministers went out because they thought this is just going to be the new Scotland. It said, unpassable woods, vast desolations never frequented by man as it is today. The land itself is pleasant, fruitful and rich, if only we had means to subdue it and skill to improve it. But wanting these, we are a poor, graceless, shiftless and heartless company, labouring under all disagreements. That's where you came in on, Henry. No provisions, but what we brought from Scotland, which is now musty, rotten, old and salt, and yet like to be very exhausted, which if we get no supply speedily from Scotland will reduce us to the greatest extremity. And it did. They did try to build the settlements within the fort. They busied as fast as possible, but there was indecision. They waited off the coast until and it was not until 1700 that they really started rebuilding the settlement. And listen to this. This is the priority. We have been busy as possible since our arrival in getting huts built, whereof we have got 72 for planters, each 12 foot long and 10 foot broad, and 15 huts for officers, 30 foot long and 16 foot broad. Also, we have built 2 storehouses and otherwise repaired the guardhouse. So with all this said, and with the archaeology. Eventually it was attacked. It was a substantial attack. We won't go through those details. There was great mortality at the hands of the fighting as well, which they were not expecting. And here we go, coming to the conclusion. How grim the conditions were at the end can also be gauged from the archaeological evidence. The Spanish forces were able to capture the modest water supply that lay immediately outside the fort and defend their control with a small battery. So they stopped people having anything to drink. So in other words, they found that in the archaeology because they saw defenses on the Spanish side defending the water source. The Spanish fleet controlled the harbour. Venturing out by boat to the watering bay would have not been an option, so they couldn't get water from watering bay. A pathetic attempt made to dig a well inside the fort, and this was located in 2004. But they say that this was brackish and most wholesome water they found. In the archaeology, they found a small number of cannonballs. Pieces of canister and chain shot were found during the survey, which probably arrived during the Spanish bombardment. So the Spanish were being brutal. There were also a large number of musket balls, many of which had been fired into the fort and outside. Most telling were the balls which appear to have been crudely made and seem to have been made on site. Spreads of molten lead were found in a number of places on the surface, and it is likely that the colonists were melting down their lead and pewter vessels to manufacture extra shot, which they would use to defend themselves. The Scots had no option but to capitulate on the 31st of March, agreeing to leave the colony on the 12th of April. They were in such a weak condition that the Spanish had to assist their boats out of the harbour. So you know, the Spanish had actually were feeling sorry for the Scots. They offered to help the Scots and their vessels out of the harbour. This tells you how bad the situation was. The fleet fared little better than the first expedition, with 2 ships being lost in a hurricane off Charleston on the 3rd of September 1700. So they had survived. The people who'd survived were then lost in 2 ships. And then all we've now got left is, I think, 2 remaining ships. Although the Scots had left the site, the Spanish left a garrison of 30 soldiers behind at Fort St. Andrew to ensure they did not return. There was a surprising amount of archaeological evidence for their presence as well, as we've already mentioned. And what they found, little bits of spurs, sword hilts, a mule shoe. So they actually had mules. The Spanish had mules, which was great. There were also quantities of Spanish pottery, as we've mentioned. Pottery actually also from Panama, interestingly enough. So, you know, there's evidence of the Spanish being there, which is great. The Spanish occupied the site, lasted less than a year. The archaeological evidence suggests that at this point, the indigenous population moved to occupy the site as well as that of the Spanish base camp, presumably taking advantage of the cleared ground. And we can actually see evidence of their pottery as well. Finally, the conclusion is, this is the conclusion. An archaeological perspective on the Darien colony cannot alone resolve the wider historical questions, but they've answered some. We can understand that it was a fruitless task. The fortifications to create Fort St. Andrew explain why so much labor was expended to defend themselves rather than to create the fields and plantations that would have enabled them to survive without relying on either food from Scotland or from the indigenous population. So, you know, it was bad planning. Everything was bad planning. Shortages of food, and indeed the archaeological evidence of only rare bone finds from occupation layers, despite the quantities of salt beef being described on board, tells us that the whole thing was a constant problem. You know, they didn't take advantage of local beasts. Patterson's dream of a Scottish Central American colony never came close to realization. Not only was the colony not properly located where it should be, was very close to a place that they could have created a really good defendable site known as Akla, which was 5 miles away. And when we look at this whole proposal, it's almost as if it's the precursor for the Panama Canal scheme, and linking coast to coast. And that was not done until 1855 with a railroad from the two coastlines. Patterson believed, even with this failure, as a banker he is, in 1701, after he had returned back from New York, Drummond never did, which we'll tell you about in a short while, a proposal to plant a colony in Darien. He still believed will naturally circulate and flow all the treasures, wealth, and rich commodities of the spacious South Sea. Trade will increase trade, and money will beget money. Thus, this door to the seas, one second, this door to the seas, and key to the universe with anything of a reasonable management will, of course, enable its proprietors to give laws to both oceans and to become arbitrators of the commercial world. In lots of ways, the canal realised the Scottish dream, but this was a Scottish dream that turned into a nightmare. And I am reminded by Jessica, who's going to remind me to say yes.
You said to remind you to why it was stupid, something they had done.
Right. Okay. Here we go. Obviously, the reaction to the disaster in Scotland was horrific. You know, the company had completely failed. Drummond, Robert Drummond, who was one of the deputies for Patterson, returned back to Scotland. You can imagine what people felt of him. And he said, look, I'm going to recoup everybody's money. So he left the Clyde in 2 ships, the Speedy Return, and another vessel as well called the Continent. And he was eventually told by the board, the Scottish company, he was told to go to Africa. That's where we should have gone in the first place. Go to Africa and create a colony in Africa, or gather as much gold as you possibly can from Africa and bring it back. So they got to Africa, and instead of heading to recover gold, they decided to go into the slave trade. To sell the slaves, they needed to go to the market at Madagascar. So they went to Madagascar, and they bumped into a pirate known as John Bowen. And John Bowen said, can I loan your 2 ships? And Drummond said, yes, you can loan my 2 ships. And Bowen said, if I can loan you 2 ships, I will give you loads of gold. Anyway, the Drummonds backed out. But Bowen said, right, I'm going to take your ships anyway. So you can imagine the situation. They've got all these slaves. They're on Madagascar. A pirate's buggered off with their 2 ships. The Drummonds have no ships. They've got all these slaves running around. And strangely enough, the Drummonds disappear. They fall out of history. What happened? What the end of the story is that the Scottish company sent out one more ship, one last ship, to see if they could make a colony work. And this last ship went into difficulties. And that was the end of the scheme. And the final thing to be said about this whole enterprise, the consequence of failure meant that in 1707, there was the Acts of Union between the Parliaments of Scotland and England. Some Scottish nobility petitioned Westminster to wipe out the Scottish national debt and stabilise the currency. In 1706, the English Parliament refused. And then they went with another proposal. The proposal was, if we go into unity with England, we unify the 2 parliaments and we become one nation, will you pay back the money that we've put into the Darien scheme? and the English Parliament agreed. Money talks, so that the Scottish nobility handed over their country. The Parliament was unified and was to sit in London at Westminster, and that led to the end of Scottish independence. And that we will end the lecture. So is there anything anyone would like to ask any questions? We'll put all your mics on. Jessica, is there anything else that you would like to say to your side?
No, I thought it was a really good lecture. Again, learned something new. But yeah, it was really interesting.
Thank you. And what about you? What about you? Who are we talking about? Henri, the Frenchman.
Hi there. Going back to an early point that Bill made about surveying the site and looking at the map you had, it's quite clear that the land here is actually very, very mountainous.
Yes.
So therefore, how could they farm anything easily with that type of land?
Yeah, they wouldn't have been able to. They could have given it a go. They could have farmed something, but they didn't farm anything by the looks of it. Bill, what would you like to say?
I was to ask what the aftermath of all this was and what the reaction of all the investors were who had lost all this money. I think you've answered that pretty comprehensively, Karl. It just goes to show that there's nothing new about major cock-ups when it comes to finance, is there?
No, it's, you know, there was basically this, that's last thing, the company sent out another ship, but she was lost at sea. And when she was lost at sea, this was blamed on some English sailors. And lots of different things like this. And, you know, people were very, very angry. You know, this was considered their best chance of being part of a major effort to create an empire by themselves. And basically the nobleman said, right, the best chance that we've got now in 1707 is to have unity with the English, and our best interests are with the English and not against the English. And this is what the nobleman thought. But basically they sold themselves out. Most of the national debt in Scotland was wiped out, and the currency stabilized, however, at the loss of independence. Anyone else like to say anything else?
When you said they paid off everything, who were they? Were they paying to ship owners, or paying to investors? Or, I mean, investors lost all their money and it was only the national debt that got paid back?
Well, it's saying, what this says is that the noblemen were refunded, and that levels of the national debt. So yeah, I think you've got a point there. I don't think everybody was compensated. I think lots of people lost out, but the people who had talk and money, they were the ones who were compensated. You know, the big corporations are the ones who were looked after, not you and I, Pat. I think this is what
the nobility.
I think that's where all the resentment comes from as well, you know, the ordinary people. Like always, it's ordinary people who usually get hurt, and they, you know, they've had to emigrate to all sorts of places because of the way they were treated in their own country.
Exactly.
So it's just pathetic, really, what people do.
And on that, Pat, you got the last say.
Well, it was very interesting. I'm comparing it to the Patagonia Welsh colony that was successful. Although eventually they were taken over by Spain, but they still speak Welsh down there.
Mm.
And that's an interesting point. But in different circumstances, I think, different circumstances.
And they weren't trying to empire build. They were just trying to save anyone who went out of the country to still be Welsh, rather than just becoming Americans or some other country. So there's
I can see that. I can see that. That's a good one.
And there's no rush to visit Darien, I think.
Yeah, I suppose that's something, like you say, something completely new, somewhere completely new for Scotland, you know. where they could be Scottish. I suppose that's what they wanted.
But it didn't work that way.
No.
I just like to remind you, don't forget about tomorrow on YouTube. Next week we're going to be doing the Minoans. Those that need to make bank transfers, do that also. Anyone else like to say anything else before we finish? Bill, I will see you Wednesday.
Very good.
Thank you,
Enjoyed it very
Carl.
much.
Thank
Very
you.
good,
Bye.
Carl. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
So,
Thank you.
okay, we're all going, are we? Okay, then I'm going to say, Jessica, don't forget Wednesday if you can.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Yeah, I've got
Bye,
something
everyone.
prepared anyway.
Okay.
Bye then.
Stay
Bye-bye.
there a minute, Jess. See you, Bill.
Bye then.
Bye to everyone.
Stay,
Bye, everybody.
bye, Henry.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, Anne. Bye, Pat. See you, everybody. They've all left the building, right? So, yes,
Me?
you. There's
Yeah,
only you left, unless I
I was-
talk to myself.
So, you know, on Wednesday, we'll